The warship drifted across the endless dark of space, its metal frame glowing faintly with blue lights. Inside its massive halls, silence reigned except for the steady hum of machines and the heavy steps of armored guards. Deep in the lower decks was a narrow chamber, cold and bare, holding only a single figure. Her name was Myra. For as long as she could remember, Myra had lived in that chamber. To the empire that ruled the stars, she was not a girl. She was an object, a tool that could be used and stored. Her people had a rare gift. They could control energy fields with their minds, bending power currents and machines as if they were threads. Because of this gift, her people had been hunted, captured, and turned into living instruments for the Empire's ships and weapons. Myra had been taken when she was young, and since then, her life had been nothing more than following commands. The walls of her cell were gray metal, smooth and cold. A single faint light glowed from above, never turning off, never dimming. The chamber had no windows, no softness, no warmth. Every day, guards came to unlock the door, ordering her to follow. They brought her to control rooms, where they connected her to cables and machines. She was forced to direct power currents through the ship's engines, or stabilize shields when battles shook the hull. When her task was done, she was sent back to the empty chamber. No words of thanks were spoken. No one asked if she was tired, or if she was in pain. To them, she was just a part of the ship. Myra had learned long ago not to speak. The first time she had resisted, they had tightened the restraints on her arms until she could not move for hours. The second time, they had left her without food until her stomach burned with hunger. After that, she became silent. She obeyed. Her face showed no expression, her eyes looked at no one. Inside, though, her thoughts were still alive. She wondered about freedom. She wondered what the sky looked like on a real world. She wondered if anyone would ever see her as more than a thing. Time passed slowly. Days felt like years. Years felt like eternity. She began to lose count of how long she had been there. The chamber became her world. The cold floor became her bed. The humming of the ship became the only sound she knew. Yet Myra had not lost everything. Deep in her heart, there was a small flame, faint but still burning. It was the memory of her mother's voice from long ago, before she was taken. Her mother had whispered to her, telling her she was not an object, telling her she was alive, telling her she was loved. Myra held on to that memory, even when everything else felt empty. One cycle, as the warship sailed through space, Myra was called once more to the control chamber. She was connected to the machines, her arms bound with thin metal cuffs, her body wrapped with energy wires. She closed her eyes, sending her power into the circuits. Lights flickered as she guided energy to the engines. Around her, officers shouted orders, their voices sharp and cold. She ignored them, focusing only on her task. To her, it was routine, a task she had done countless times. But then something unusual happened. The ship shuddered as if struck from outside. Sirens wailed, flashing red across the walls. Myra opened her eyes slightly. Through the glass of the chamber, she saw officers rushing to their stations. The guards tightened their grip on their weapons. An attack. The Empire warship was being pursued. She could hear the distant echo of cannons, the vibration of shields straining under heavy fire. But it was not the attackers that caught Myra's attention. It was the prisoners brought aboard after the skirmish. They were humans. From where she sat, connected to the machines, Myra caught sight of them through a wide corridor as they were marched past by guards. They looked tired, their hands bound, but their eyes were sharp and alive. She had seen many prisoners over the years, yet something about them felt different. They looked at the world with fire, not with silence. One of them turned his head as he walked past. His gaze met Myra's for only a moment. He was tall, with dark hair and steady eyes. Unlike everyone else who had ever looked at her, his eyes did not see an object. They did not see a machine. They saw her. Myra felt a strange pull inside her chest. She lowered her gaze quickly, afraid to hold it for too long. The guards pushed the humans forward, leading them deeper into the ship. Soon, the corridor was empty again. Myra was left alone with the machines, her heart beating faster than before. That single look stayed with her long after she was unhooked and sent back to her chamber. She lay on the cold floor, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the moment. She had lived years in silence, years unseen, years treated as nothing. Yet one glance from a human soldier had shaken her world. For the first time in a long while, she felt the flame in her heart burn brighter. She did not know his name. She did not know if she would ever see him again. But Myra knew one thing. That man had looked at her as if she mattered. And that single truth was enough to change something deep inside her. In the stillness of her chamber, Myra closed her eyes. For the first time in years, her lips formed the faint shadow of a smile. The Empire warship sailed through the dark sea of space like a floating fortress. Its outer hull carried scars from the last battle, but the crew inside stood firm. They had captured new prisoners during the skirmish, and those prisoners were now being dragged into the lower decks. Myra sat quietly in her chamber, her arms resting on her knees, her mind still unsettled. She had seen them earlier through the wide corridor. Humans. She had heard of them before. Rumors spread through the guards who sometimes spoke too loudly. Humans were stubborn, they said. Reckless. Dangerous. But Myra had never seen one up close until now. When the door to her chamber opened again, the sound of boots striking metal echoed down the hall. Guards marched past, escorting the humans to the cells nearby. Myra moved closer to the bars that formed part of her door, pressing her face to the cold metal. From the shadows, she watched. The humans walked in a line, their hands tied with thick bands of steel. Some stumbled from exhaustion, others glared at the guards with unbroken spirit. One man in particular walked with steady steps. His dark hair was messy from the fight, and his clothes were torn, but his eyes were calm and sharp. This was the same man who had looked at Myra before. When his gaze swept the hall again, it landed on her chamber. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. This time, Myra did not look away. She held his gaze, her chest tightening as if something inside her was waking from a long sleep. His eyes were not filled with pity or cruelty. They were filled with recognition, as if he was silently saying, "I see you." The guard beside him shoved his shoulder roughly, forcing him forward. Still, the human's eyes lingered on Myra until the hallway turned and he was out of sight. Myra stepped back into the shadows of her cell. Her hands trembled against her sides. No one had ever looked at her like that before. To the Empire, she was only a living tool, but to this human stranger, she was something else. The thought stayed in her mind long after the guards locked the nearby cells and left. That night, Myra lay awake on the floor of her chamber. The faint hum of the ship was her only companion. But this time, her mind was not filled only with silence. She kept remembering the human's eyes, how steady they were, how alive they seemed. A strange warmth spread through her chest. For years, she had told herself hope was dangerous. Hope could be crushed. But now, for the first time, she wanted to believe it again. The next cycle, Myra was once again taken to the control chamber. She was connected to the machines, energy cables attached to her arms. Officers barked orders as the ship prepared to jump to another star system. Myra obeyed, guiding energy through the circuits with her mind. Her body shook with strain, but she endured as she always had. When the task was finished, the guards unhooked her and began leading her back. But instead of her usual chamber, they passed through the corridor where the human prisoners were kept. The cells lined the walls, and inside each one, Myra saw the humans sitting or standing. Some leaned against the bars, others whispered quietly to one another. Her heart raced as she scanned the row of cells. Then she saw him. The same man. He sat near the front of his cell, his back against the wall, his head lifted when he heard the sound of her footsteps. Their eyes met again. The guards pushed Myra forward, but she slowed her steps just enough to keep his gaze a moment longer. The human gave her the faintest nod, so small the guards did not notice. It was a silent greeting. A wordless promise. Myra felt her breath catch in her throat. She lowered her eyes quickly, but not before her lips curved with the faintest trace of something she had almost forgotten: hope. Later, when the guards returned Myra to her chamber and locked the heavy door, she sat against the wall with her knees drawn up to her chest. She pressed her hand to her heart, feeling it race. She whispered softly to herself, a word that felt strange on her tongue after so many silent years. Alive. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt alive. Over the next days, Myra noticed the humans more often. Whenever she was taken through the corridor, she caught small glimpses of them. They spoke to one another in quiet voices, planning, whispering, never fully broken. They were different from the other prisoners she had seen before. They did not sink into silence. They carried something she had nearly lost: a fire inside. And always, her eyes searched for him. The dark-haired human. The one who had looked at her as if she was more than a tool. Each time their gazes crossed, Myra felt the flame inside her grow stronger. She began to wonder about him. What was his name? Why had he been here? What would he say if he could speak to her freely? One cycle, while she was being led back from the control chamber, she heard a sound that made her steps falter. It was his voice. Low, steady, speaking through the bars of his cell when the guards were distracted. "You are not a machine," he said softly, his eyes locked on hers. Myra froze. The guards did not hear. They were too busy speaking among themselves. Only Myra heard. Her chest tightened as the words sank into her heart. For years, she had lived in silence, never once hearing anyone say she was more than an object. And now, this human stranger had given her the words she had longed to hear. She did not reply. She dared not risk the guards noticing. But as she walked past his cell, her eyes shone with something new. A spark. Back in her chamber, Myra sat in the dark, repeating his words over and over in her mind. "You are not a machine." The phrase wrapped around her heart like a shield. It gave her strength. It gave her courage. For the first time in years, she felt that her life was not just a chain of orders and commands. For the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she could be free. The warship drifted in silence across the stars, but inside, tension was rising. The human prisoners remained locked in their cells, watched closely by guards. Myra continued her routine of being taken to the control chambers, connected to machines, and drained of her strength. To anyone else, nothing seemed different. But inside Myra, something had begun to change. It started with the words of the human soldier. "You are not a machine." Those words echoed in her mind every time she sat in her cold chamber. They stayed with her when the guards pushed her forward roughly, when the officers ordered her to bend her power to their will. Even when she was alone in silence, the words would return, lighting a small flame in her heart. She could not forget the look in his eyes either. Unlike everyone else aboard the ship, he had not looked past her. He had seen her. Each time their paths crossed, each time their eyes met, Myra felt the flame inside her grow stronger. She did not yet know his name, but already she trusted him more than anyone she had known on this ship. One cycle, after guiding energy into the ship's engines, Myra was being led back down the corridor. The guards were distracted, muttering to each other about the next orders. As she passed the row of human cells, she saw him again. He was standing near the bars, his hands still bound by steel bands, his back straight despite the chains. His eyes met hers, steady and calm. "Do you hear me?" he whispered softly, his voice barely reaching her. Myra's steps slowed. She gave the smallest nod, so small it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. "Good," the man said quietly. "I don't want you to forget. You are alive. You are more than what they say." The guards turned their heads and Myra quickly lowered her gaze, letting the guards push her along. But her heart was racing. The warmth in his words spread through her like light breaking into a dark room. Back in her chamber, Myra sat against the wall, hugging her knees. She replayed his words again and again. It was dangerous to listen, even more dangerous to believe, yet she could not stop herself. His voice had broken the silence she had lived with for years. It gave her strength she had not known she still carried. Days passed, and Myra began to change in small ways. When the officers shouted at her, she no longer felt only fear. She felt anger. When the guards pushed her, she no longer felt only pain. She felt resistance stirring inside. It was not enough to rise against them, not yet, but the flame inside her burned brighter. One night, as the ship sailed through empty space, Myra was startled awake by the sound of footsteps near her chamber. She pressed her ear against the bars and listened. The guards were talking. Their voices were careless, too loud. "The humans are stubborn," one said with a laugh. "Even in chains, they talk of escape." "Escape," the other scoffed. "There's no escape from this ship. Let them dream." Their footsteps faded, leaving Myra alone in the dark. She sat back, her mind racing. Escape. The word felt strange, almost impossible, but it stirred something inside her. For so long, she had believed freedom was only a dream. But now, the humans carried that dream openly, even while in chains. And if they could believe, perhaps she could too. The next day, when Myra was once again led past the human cells, she dared to let her eyes rest on the man's face for longer than before. The guards were speaking to each other again, their attention turned away. He looked at her calmly, and this time, he spoke with more strength in his voice, though still low enough not to be heard by the guards. "My name is Dan," he said. "What is yours?" Myra froze. No one had asked her name in years. She had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be called anything other than object or tool. Her lips trembled as she formed the word. "Myra." Dan's eyes softened, and for a moment, she thought she saw pride in his expression. "Myra," he repeated. "That is your name. Remember it. Hold it close." The guards pushed her forward, and the moment ended. But Myra's heart beat wildly in her chest. She whispered her name under her breath as she walked. Myra. It sounded strange and wonderful all at once. She was not only a tool. She had a name. Later, in her chamber, Myra could not stop thinking of it. Dan had risked speaking to her. If the guards had heard, he would have been punished. Yet he had done it anyway. Not for himself, but for her. That truth lit her heart like a fire. The days that followed were filled with quiet exchanges. Small words, whispered when the guards were not looking. Short glances that carried more than entire conversations. Myra learned that Dan was a soldier, taken prisoner after a failed raid. He spoke not of surrender but of survival. He spoke of his people and how they believed that no chain could hold the human spirit forever. Myra listened in silence, her heart drinking in his words like water after a long drought. Every time he spoke, she felt stronger. Every time he looked at her, she felt less like an object and more like a person. One cycle, as Myra was being led past, Dan's voice reached her again. "You can resist," he whispered. "Even in small ways. They want you to forget who you are. Do not let them win." Myra did not answer, but her eyes told him she understood. That night, when the guards ordered her to lie down and rest, she did not obey right away. She sat upright, staring at the wall, her eyes sharp. It was a small act, invisible to them, but to her, it was everything. For the first time, she was not obeying in silence. For the first time, she was choosing to defy, even if only in her heart. The spark had been lit. Myra pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat. The flame inside her burned brighter than ever before. She was no longer only a tool of the Empire. She was Myra, and she was alive. The warship floated in silence through the black sea of space, its engines glowing faintly in the dark. Inside, life continued with the same strict order. Guards marched, officers barked commands, and prisoners were watched like animals in cages. To the Empire, everything was in control. But beneath the surface, something new was beginning to stir. Myra sat in her cold chamber, her knees drawn close to her chest. The silence around her felt heavy, but inside her heart burned brighter than ever. Dan's words echoed in her thoughts, giving her strength. She had started to believe that perhaps she was not doomed to live as a tool forever. It was during one of her routine transfers to the control chamber that everything began to change. Myra had just been unhooked from the machines, her body aching after hours of channeling power into the ship's systems. As the guards led her back, she passed the human cells again. The prisoners sat quietly, but Myra noticed their sharp eyes. They were not broken. They were watching, waiting, thinking. Dan stood near the bars of his cell, his face calm and steady as always. When her eyes met his, he spoke in a voice so low only she could hear. "They will move you soon," he whispered. "I heard the guards speak. They are taking you to the capital." Myra's steps faltered. She glanced at him, her chest tightening. She knew what that meant. She had heard stories from other captives long ago. Those taken to the capital were never seen again. The Empire studied them, drained them, and broke them until nothing remained. Fear rushed through her, but before she could lower her eyes, Dan continued. "I will not let that happen," he said firmly. His eyes locked on hers. "We will escape." Myra almost stumbled, her breath catching. Escape. The word felt too big, too impossible. Her hands trembled at the thought. The guards pushed her forward, unaware of the quiet exchange. Back in her chamber, Myra could not rest. She pressed her back against the cold wall, her mind racing. Dan had spoken of escape as if it was not only a dream but a plan. Yet how could it be done on this fortress of steel, with guards watching every move and weapons ready at every turn? The next cycle, Myra was once again led through the corridor. Dan was waiting. This time, his words came quickly, timed between the steps of the guards. "There will be a transfer," he whispered. "When they move you, I will act. My squad will help. We will create a distraction. You must be ready to run." Myra's eyes widened, but her voice refused to form sound. She could only stare at him, her heart pounding like a drum. "You must decide," Dan said, his voice steady. "If you choose to stay, they will take you to the capital, and you will never return. If you choose to trust me, you may have a chance at freedom. But it will be dangerous. For you, and for me." The guards shouted at her to keep moving, and Myra turned her eyes away. Yet his words echoed inside her as if carved into her soul. She was being asked to make a choice she had never been given before. For years, her life had been nothing but obedience. Now, for the first time, she could choose. That night in her chamber, Myra lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her body was weak, but her mind burned with questions. Could she trust him? What if it was a trick? What if he failed and she was punished even more? The fear was heavy. But then she remembered the way he had looked at her, the way he had spoken her name with respect, the way he had said she was not a machine. Her heart whispered the answer before her mind could argue. She trusted him. The following day, as she passed the cells again, Myra slowed her steps for only a second. She looked at Dan, and though she did not speak, her eyes carried the answer. A single word, unspoken but clear yes. Dan gave the faintest nod. His lips formed the words silently, without sound. Be ready. From that moment, Myra's world changed. Every sound of footsteps, every order shouted by the guards, every flicker of the ship's lights made her heart race. She knew something was coming. The days felt longer as she waited. Myra's thoughts spun between fear and hope. At times, she wondered if she had made a mistake, if trusting a human prisoner was foolish. But then she would remember the hopeless silence of her life before, and she knew she could not return to it. She would rather risk everything than remain an object forever. At last, the cycle of transfer came. The warship docked with a larger vessel, preparing to move Myra. The guards arrived at her chamber in greater numbers than usual, their weapons ready. They ordered her to stand and bound her wrists with energy cuffs. Myra's heart raced, but she kept her face still. As they led her down the corridor, she saw Dan and the other humans waiting in their cells. Their eyes followed her, steady and fierce. She felt their silent support like a shield around her. When her gaze met Dan's, he gave her one last nod. It was time. The guards continued their march, unaware of what was about to happen. Myra's chest rose and fell with fast breaths. Fear clung to her, but beneath it was something stronger, a spark of defiance, burning bright. For years, she had been nothing more than a tool. But now, for the first time, she was making a choice. She was stepping into the unknown, not as an object, but as Myra. The dangerous plan had begun. The docking bay of the warship was alive with movement. Heavy doors groaned as they opened, revealing a transport vessel waiting to carry Myra away. Guards stood in rows, their weapons gleaming under the harsh white lights. The air felt tense, thick with the weight of authority. Myra walked between two guards, her wrists bound in energy cuffs that glowed faintly. Her steps were slow, but her heart was racing faster than ever. She tried to keep her face calm, but inside her chest burned with fear and hope. She knew this was the moment Dan had spoken of. The moment everything would either end or begin. As they crossed the wide floor of the docking bay, Myra's eyes flickered toward the row of cells along the wall. The human prisoners were still locked inside, but they stood pressed against the bars, their eyes fixed on her. And among them was Dan. His gaze met hers with a steady calm, as if to say, "Do not be afraid." The officer in charge barked orders to prepare for transfer. The guards moved with practiced precision, forming a circle around Myra. She was pushed toward the transport vessel, its ramp lowered like the open mouth of a beast. And then it began. A loud crash rang out as one of the human prisoners slammed his chains against the bars. Sparks flew, and a shout followed. The guards turned their heads in alarm, shouting for silence. In that instant, Dan acted. With a sudden burst of strength, he drove his bound fists into the face of the nearest guard through the bars. The man staggered back, blood rushing from his nose. Chaos spread through the docking bay. The guards shouted and rushed toward the cells, forgetting their tight circle around Myra. The prisoners inside roared, striking the bars and pulling at their chains, adding to the confusion. The alarms blared, red lights flashing across the walls. Dan broke free in the chaos. One of his squad members managed to grab a weapon from a fallen guard and fired at the locks of the cells. Sparks exploded as the doors slid open. The humans surged out like a wave, their chains rattling but their spirits unbroken. "Now, Myra." Dan's voice cut through the noise. Myra's breath caught. Her wrists still bound, she hesitated for half a heartbeat. Then she felt the flame inside her burst into fire. She closed her eyes and focused, letting her energy flow through her body. The cuffs trembled against her skin before shattering in a spray of sparks. The guards turned in shock, realizing too late that their tool had become something else. With her hands free, Myra raised her arms. The energy around her pulsed, bending to her will. Lights flickered, panels cracked, and the docking bay doors shuddered as power surged wildly. Guards staggered as their weapons shorted out in their hands. Dan rushed toward her, blocking a strike from a guard and driving his shoulder into the man's chest. He grabbed a weapon from the fallen guard and tossed it aside, choosing instead to shield Myra with his own body. "Move," he shouted. Together they ran across the floor, weaving through the chaos. The humans fought fiercely, using whatever they could to hold back the guards. Myra used her powers to blast open the path, sending bursts of energy into the walls and forcing doors open. For the first time, she was not obeying the Empire. She was choosing her own way. The transport vessel loomed ahead. Guards rushed to block the ramp, but Myra lifted her hands and sent a wave of energy rippling through the air. The guards flew back as if struck by an invisible storm. The ramp groaned, sparks shooting from its edges as Myra bent the power lines holding it. Dan grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. Inside the transport, the walls shook as alarms screamed louder. Dan's squad rushed aboard, dragging their wounded with them. Myra stumbled, her body weak from the strain of using her powers so freely, but Dan's hand steadied her. "Can you fly it?" he asked, his voice urgent. Myra's eyes darted to the control panels, half broken from neglect. She had never flown a ship before, but she could feel the power running through its circuits like veins of light. She nodded quickly, her breath heavy. Dan gave her a firm look, then turned to cover her as more guards stormed into the bay. Gunfire echoed, sparks exploding as metal walls were struck. The humans fired back, buying Myra time. She placed her hands on the controls, closing her eyes as she let her energy flow into the system. The engines groaned, coughing like an old beast waking from slumber. Lights flickered across the console as Myra bent the currents, forcing them to life. The ship shuddered, its thrusters glowing brighter and brighter. "We have power!" Myra cried. Dan turned, firing one last shot before slamming the ramp controls. The door sealed shut, blocking the guards outside. The humans collapsed into seats, gasping for breath, their bodies bruised but their eyes alive with hope. Dan dropped into the seat beside Myra. "Take us out." Myra focused harder, her hands trembling as she guided the power through the engines. The vessel shook violently as it lifted from the bay floor. Alarms screamed on every side, voices shouting through the comms, but Myra ignored them all. She pushed the engines harder, pouring her strength into the ship. With a roar, the transport tore free from the docking bay. The warship's defenses lit up, beams of energy firing toward them, but Myra shifted the power to the shields. Sparks danced across the vessel's hull as the blast struck, but they held. Dan gripped the controls beside her, steadying the ship as it darted into the darkness of space. The warship grew smaller behind them, its lights flashing like the eyes of a predator. The humans cheered, their voices filled with relief and triumph. Myra slumped forward, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her heart soared. For the first time in her life, she was no longer a prisoner. She was no longer an object. She was free, and it was because a human had risked everything for her. Dan placed a steady hand on her shoulder. His voice was low but firm. "You did it, Myra." Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. She lifted her eyes to his, and for the first time, she allowed herself a true smile. The breakout had succeeded, but their journey was only beginning. The transport ship tore through the black sea of space, its engines burning with borrowed strength. Behind them, the massive warship shrank into the distance, but its lights still flashed like angry eyes. Myra sat in the pilot's chair, her body weak but her mind focused. Every part of the ship seemed to hum in rhythm with her heartbeat. Dan stood beside her, scanning the control screens. His squad was scattered across the cabin, tending to wounds, reloading weapons, and holding tightly to the hope that they had truly escaped. The air inside the transport was heavy with tension, but under it was something stronger. Freedom. Shields are holding, Myra whispered, her voice thin. Dan leaned closer to check the panel. The readings flickered, showing the strain of every hit they had taken. Not for long. That warship will not let us go so easily. As if answering his words, the ship shook violently. Red lights flashed across the control board as enemy fire grazed their side. Myra gritted her teeth, steadying the vessel with both hands. They are chasing us, she said, her voice steady even as her arms trembled. Dan placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we make them chase. We will not stop now. The other humans gathered near. One of them, a tall soldier named Bryn, spoke quickly. We cannot outrun them forever. Their weapons will cut us apart. We need a plan. Myra closed her eyes for a moment. Her energy was nearly spent, but she could still feel the ship's power flowing like streams beneath her palms. She listened to the rhythm of the engines and the hum of the shields, as if the vessel itself whispered to her. There is a nebula ahead, she said quietly. Her eyes opened, glowing faintly with the trace of her power. Dense gases, strong storms. Their scanners will lose us inside. Dan frowned. A nebula is dangerous. One mistake and we will burn. Myra turned to look at him, her expression calm. It is our only chance. Dan studied her face, then nodded. Then we take it? The humans braced themselves as Myra guided the transport toward the glowing cloud ahead. The nebula hung in the void like a living storm, its swirling colors stretching across space in waves of blue and red. Lightning flashed deep inside, like the heart of a raging sea. The warship fired again, beams of light streaking past them. One struck their side, shaking the cabin so hard that Myra almost lost control. Sparks burst from a console behind them, and one of the squad members shouted in pain as smoke filled the air. Hold steady. Dan shouted over the noise. Myra's hands glowed as she forced her strength into the controls. The ship bucked like a wild creature, but it did not fall. She pushed it harder, straight into the storm of the nebula. The moment they crossed the edge, the world outside turned into chaos. Clouds of glowing gas swirled, lightning flashed across their view, and the sensors screamed in confusion. The ship groaned as energy waves slammed against its hull. The humans held onto their seats, faces pale but determined. Dan kept his hand on the back of Myra's chair, steadying both her and himself. Can you see anything? He asked. Myra shook her head slightly, sweat dripping down her face. Not with eyes. But I feel the way. She guided the vessel not by the sensors, which flickered uselessly, but by the flow of energy she sensed within the storm. She leaned forward, her eyes half closed, her hands pressed firmly against the controls. The warship followed them in, its massive shape looming behind the storm clouds. Beams of fire cut through the nebula, lighting the gases like sudden suns. One blast came close, shaking their ship again, but the storm twisted the light and bent it away. They are still on us, Bryn growled. Myra's voice was quiet, almost like a whisper. Not for long. She raised one hand from the controls, letting her energy flow into the storm around them. The nebula answered, its clouds swirling faster, its lightning growing wilder. The storm bent and shifted, wrapping itself between their ship and the pursuing warship. The enemy vessel tried to fire again, but the lightning struck its side, shorting its weapons. The humans inside the transport gasped as they watched the great ship stagger. Myra pressed harder, pouring the last of her strength into the storm. The nebula roared like a living beast. A wave of gas and lightning rolled between the ships, breaking the scanners, cutting the enemy's view. When the storm calmed for a breath, the warship was gone from sight. The cabin was silent except for the heavy breaths of the crew. Dan leaned down, looking at Myra. Her face was pale, her body trembling. She had nearly collapsed in her chair. "You saved us," he said firmly. Myra shook her head weakly. "We are not safe yet. The storm will not hold them forever. We need a place to land. A place to hide." Dan looked at the others. Bryn nodded, his voice low but strong. "There is a small station near the edge of the sector. Old, forgotten. We used it once during patrols. If it still stands, we may rest there." Dan turned back to Myra. "Can you guide us?" Her eyes closed for a moment, and then she whispered, "Yes. But I will need help." Dan placed his hands over hers on the controls. His strength was nothing like hers, but his presence steadied her. Together they pushed the ship forward, guiding it through the thick storms of the nebula. The humans worked behind them, repairing systems, tending to the wounded, and watching the clouds for any sign of pursuit. Hours passed like that, each moment heavy with both danger and hope. Finally, the storm began to thin, the clouds giving way to the dark quiet of open space. And there, far ahead, a shadow drifted. It was an old station, broken in places, its lights dim, but it still floated like a relic of the past. The humans cheered softly, their voices filled with relief. Myra guided the transport closer, landing it gently on the station's worn platform. The engines dimmed, the cabin falling into silence. For a long moment, no one moved. They had escaped the warship. They had survived the storm. They were free, if only for now. Dan looked at Myra. She was leaning back in the chair, eyes closed, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion. But there was a faint smile on her lips, the first true smile he had ever seen from her. "You are safe now," he whispered. Myra opened her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze. Her voice was quiet, but every word carried the weight of truth. "For the first time in my life, I feel it." The humans settled into the station, their bodies weary but their spirits alive. The galaxy outside was vast and dangerous, but for the first time, they were not alone. Myra and Dan had led them through fire and storm, and together they would face whatever came next. The old station was silent when they landed, its metal walls creaking softly as if surprised to feel life again. Dust floated in the air, and the lights flickered weakly, powered by an ancient core that had not been touched for years. Yet to the tired group inside the transport ship, it felt like a sanctuary. Dan was the first to step out, his boots hitting the cold surface of the platform. He looked around carefully, weapon in hand, but no threat came. Behind him, Myra followed slowly, her body weak but her eyes alert. The humans spread out, checking corners, opening doors, and clearing each chamber with careful discipline. "It is empty," Bryn reported after a few minutes. "Abandoned, just as I remembered." "Then it will serve," Dan answered. He turned to Myra. "You should rest now. You nearly gave everything in that storm." Myra shook her head. "Not yet. The enemy will look for us. We must prepare." Her voice was faint, but there was steel in it. Dan studied her for a moment, then nodded. He understood. Rest could wait until safety was sure. The humans set to work quickly. Some repaired broken systems, restoring power to the station's shields and lights. Others patched the transport ship, sealing its wounds with whatever materials they could find. A few stood watch at the windows, scanning the stars for any sign of pursuit. Myra walked among them, guiding with quiet words. She moved slowly, leaning against walls at times, but her presence strengthened the crew. To them she was no longer a prisoner or a tool. She was part of them now, and her voice carried weight. Hours passed. The station grew brighter, its forgotten halls echoing again with footsteps and voices. For the first time in years, Myra felt something she had thought impossible. Belonging. When the work was done, the crew gathered in the main hall. A long table stretched through the center, and for a moment it almost felt like a home. Food was shared, laughter broke the silence, and tired smiles spread across faces that had only known war. Dan sat beside Myra, watching her carefully. She ate little, her body still weak, but her eyes were steady. "You never stopped fighting," he said softly. She looked at him. "I did not fight for myself. I fought for what you gave me. A chance." Dan's chest tightened at her words. He wanted to answer, but before he could, Bryn stood and spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "We cannot stay here forever. The enemy will not rest. If they find us, this place will not hold." Murmurs spread across the hall. Some nodded in agreement, others looked uncertain. Dan rose to his feet. "He is right," Dan said. "We have bought time, but not safety. We need to decide what comes next." The crew looked at him, waiting. Dan turned to Myra. "What do you see for us?" Myra was silent for a moment. Then she stood slowly, her hands resting on the table. "My people built chains. They believed power gave them the right to own, to break, to control. But you humans showed me something different. You risked yourselves for me. You gave without demand. If there is to be a future, it must be built on that. Not on fear. Not on chains." Her words carried through the hall like fire. The humans listened, their eyes fixed on her. Bryn spoke again, his voice rough but respectful. "And what of the warship? What of the empire that hunts you?" Myra's eyes hardened. "They will come. But if we run forever, they win. If we stand, if we build something greater, then one day others like me will see. They will know freedom is possible." Silence followed her words, deep and heavy. Then slowly, one by one, the humans nodded. Their faces were tired, their bodies wounded, but in their hearts something had awakened. A purpose. Dan placed his hand flat on the table. "Then we do not run. We rebuild. We fight for something greater than survival. We fight for tomorrow." A murmur of agreement filled the hall, growing louder until it became a cheer. For the first time, the abandoned station echoed not with silence but with hope. That night, as the crew slept, Dan found Myra standing by a window, looking out at the stars. Her figure was framed by the dim glow of the galaxy. "You should rest," he said quietly. She did not turn. "I cannot. For years I knew only darkness. Now the stars feel different. Brighter. I do not want to close my eyes." Dan stepped beside her. The silence stretched between them, but it was not heavy. It was warm. "You are free now," he said. Myra looked at him, her eyes steady. "I am free because of you. But freedom means nothing if it is only mine. I want others to know it too." Dan nodded slowly. "Then we will make it so. Together." Her lips curved into a faint smile, rare but true. Together. Days turned into weeks as they worked to strengthen the station. Old systems were repaired, new defenses built, and scouts sent into nearby sectors. The humans trained, their bond with Myra growing stronger. She taught them ways to sense energy, to read flows that machines could not. In return, they showed her how to live without chains, how to laugh without fear. One evening, as the sun of a nearby world rose and cast light through the station's windows, the crew gathered once more. The transport ship stood ready, repaired and armed, its surface gleaming with fresh markings. On its side they had painted a new symbol, not of any empire, but of unity. Myra stood with them, her head high, her heart steady. She was no longer an object, no longer a tool. She was a voice, a leader, a friend. Dan looked at her, then at the crew. The galaxy is wide. There are others out there still in chains. We will find them. We will free them. This is only the beginning. A cheer rose, strong and full, carrying through the station. Myra felt the sound deep inside her chest. For the first time, she believed in a future not shaped by her captors, but by her own choice. She turned to the stars beyond the window, her voice quiet but firm. A new dawn has come. The crew stood ready, the ship prepared, and the galaxy waiting. They had been hunted, broken, and cast aside, but they had risen. Together they would write a story of freedom that no chain could hold. And as the transport lifted from the station, its engines burning bright, Myra sat beside Dan in the cockpit. Her hands rested on the controls, steady and strong. She was no longer alone. They were no longer afraid. The future had begun.